pain is a perceptual thing as much as it's a physical thing. It's a belief system about what you're experiencing in your body. And that has important relevance for healing different types of injury and the pain associated with that injury. You can actually know how sensitive a given body part is and how much brain area is devoted to it through what's called two-point discrimination. You can do this experiment if you want. I think I've described this once or twice before, but basically if you have someone put, maybe take two pens and put them maybe 6 inches apart on your back and touch while you're facing away, and they'll ask you how many points they're touching you, and you say 2, but if they move those closer together, say 3 inches, you're likely to experience it as 1 point of contact. Whereas on your finger, you could play that game all day, and as long as there's a millimeter or so spacing, you will know that it's 2 points as opposed to 1. And that's because there's more pixels, more density of receptors. This has direct bearing to pain because it says that areas of the body that have denser receptors are going to be more sensitive to pain than to others. And where we have more receptors, we tend to have more blood vessels and glia, which are these support cells, and other cells that lend to the inflammation response. And that's really important. So just as a rule of thumb, areas of your body that are injured, that are large areas that have low sensitivity before injury, likely are going to experience less pain, and the literature shows will heal more slowly because they don't have as many cells around to produce inflammation. And you might say, wait, I thought inflammation is bad. Well, one of the things I really want to get across today is that inflammation is not bad. Inflammation out of control is bad, but inflammation is wonderful. Inflammation is the tissue repair response, and we are going to talk about subjective and objective ways to modulate inflammation after tissue injury, even after just exercise that's been too intense. Now, some of you are probably familiar with this, but for people that have an arm or a leg or a finger or some other portion of their body amputated, it's not uncommon for those people to feel as if they still have that limb or appendage or piece of their body intact. And typically, unfortunately, the sensation of that limb is not one of the limb being nice and relaxed and just there. The sensation is that the limb is experiencing pain or is contorted in the specific orientation that it was around the time of the injury. So if someone has a blunt force to the hand and they end up having their hand amputated, typically they will continue to feel pain in their phantom hand, which is pretty wild. And that's because the representation of that hand is still intact in the cortex, in the brain, and it's trying to balance its levels of activity. Normally, it's getting what's called proprioceptive feedback. Proprioception is just our knowledge of where our limbs are in space. It's an extremely important aspect of our somatosensory system. And there's no proprioceptive feedback, and so a lot of the circuits start to ramp up their levels of activity, and they become very conscious of the phantom limb. This may come as a shock to some of you, and by no means am I trying to be insensitive, but pain is a perceptual thing as much as it's a physical thing. It's a belief system about what you're experiencing in your body, and that has important relevance for healing different types of injury and the pain associated with that injury. We're all familiar with the stories of people having a cast on and then getting the cast off, and the particular limb that wasn't being used that was casted is much smaller and atrophied. Most of that atrophy, you might be surprised to learn, is not because the muscles aren't being used. It's because the nerves sending signals to those muscles are not active, and therefore the muscles aren't contracting. If we have damage to our brain in the sensory motor pathways, any number of different sensory motor pathways, or we have damage to a limb, could be a leg, could be an arm, could be a hand, there's great benefit to restricting the use of the opposite, better performing, uninjured limb or hand or other part of the body. The thing to do is not to cast up the damaged side, although you need to do that to protect the limb, of course, from further damage. So if it's a broken arm, you need to cast the arm or you need to brace the arm. But that the key thing was to restrict movement of the intact, uninjured opposite limb. And when they did that, it forced some movement in the injured limb. And remarkably, through connections from the two sides of the brain, through the corpus callosum, this huge fiber pathway that links the two sides of the brain, they saw plasticity on both sides of the brain. So this makes sense when you hear it. Let's say I injure my left ankle and I'm limping along or I'm using crutches. You would think, well, the last thing you want to do is injure your opposite limb or not use your opposite limb. My right ankle is perfectly fine. But if I lean too hard on my right limb and I take all the work out of the left limb, the left ankle, that's actually setting up a situation where there's going to be runaway asymmetry in the central pathways and the nerve to muscle pathways on my left side. And so what they suggested and what they showed in a variety of experiments was that by encouraging activity of the injured limb, provided it could be done without pain, and importantly, not just exercising that limb or part of the body, but restricting the opposite healthy part of the body, that the speed of recovery was significantly faster. Now, I want to repeat, you don't want to go injuring something further. That's probably the worst thing you could do. But in some cases where people have damage in their brain, the limbs are perfectly fine, but the motor signals aren't getting down to the limbs. And in that case, the limb is fine, so you actually are free to use either limb as much as you want. And in that case, you don't want to rely on the uninjured pathway too much. In fact, you want to restrict the uninjured pathway. And so when you're in a situation where one side is injured or the brain is injured representing one side of the body, the key thing to do is to really overwork the side that needs the work and to restrict the activity of the side that doesn't need the work because it's healthy. This is important. It means that all of our senses and our movements are competing for space in our brain. And so the way to think about the principle is anytime you're injured and you're hobbling along, you don't want to injure yourself further, but you want to try and compensate in the ways that respect this competition for neural real estate. And what that usually means is not relying on where you're still strong, because that's just going to create runaway plasticity that's going to make it very hard for you to recover the motor function and in some cases the sensory function of the damaged limb. This has been shown to accelerate the central plasticity and the recovery of function, which I think is what most people want. When people are injured, they want to get back to doing what they were doing previously, and they want to be able to do that without pain. Now, the brain wasn't thought to have a lymphatic system. It wasn't thought to have circulating immune cells, but about 10 years ago, it was sort of rediscovered, because if you look in the literature, you realize this stuff was around longer, that there's a lymphatic system. It's sort of like a sewer system that clears out the debris that surrounds neurons, especially injured neurons. And the lymphatic system is very active during sleep. It's been imaged in functional and magnetic resonance imaging, and the lymphatic system is something that you want very active because it's going to clear away the debris that sits between the neurons, and the cells that surround the connections between the neurons, called the glia, those cells are actively involved in repairing the connections between neurons when damaged. So the lymphatic system is so important that many people, if not all people who get TBI, are told, get adequate rest. You need to sleep. And that's kind of twofold advice. On the one hand, it's telling you to get sleep because all these good things happen in sleep. It's also about getting those people to not continue to engage in their activity full time or really try and hammer through it. You might say, well, if you have trouble sleeping, how are you supposed to get deep sleep? Most of the activity of the lymphatic system, this washout of the debris, is occurring during slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep, as I mentioned in a previous episode, is something that happens typically in the early part of the evening. Even for those of you that are falling, or early part of the night rather, if you're falling asleep and then waking up 3-4 hours later, it's important that you continue to get sleep, but know that the slow wave sleep is mainly packed toward the early part of the night. So that hopefully will alleviate some of the anxiety of the 3 and 4 a.m. wake up, although you really should follow some of the protocols that I've suggested in your physician's protocols in order to try and get regular longer sleep of 7-8 hours. Sleeping on one side, not on back or stomach, seems to increase the amount of washout, or wash through, I should say, of the lymphatic system. There aren't a ton of data on this, but the data that exist are pretty solid. Again, sleeping on one side or with feet slightly elevated as well has been shown to increase the rate of clearance of some of the debris. And that's because the way that the lymphatic system works is it has a physical pressure fluid dynamic to it that allow it to work more efficiently when one is sleeping on their side or with feet slightly elevated. So this means not falling asleep in a chair while watching TV. This means, if possible, not falling asleep on one's back or on one's stomach, sleeping on one side. And if you can't do that, like I don't really like to sleep on my side, I sleep with my feet slightly elevated. I put a kind of thin pillow under my ankles. I don't have TBI, but I have had a few concussions before, but right now I feel fine. But I find that putting the pillow under my ankles helps me sleep much more deeply, and I wake up feeling much more refreshed.